Good morning. This is the last daf of Pesachim, 120 daf. We've been learning this for several months, and Baruch Hashem, we got to learn the halachas of the Seder, concluding in this week, which we're going to go to the Seder. So it's a wonderful hashgacha from Hashem to learn these halachas, and we're in the midst of daf Kuf Chaf Amid Beis. Today's daf is Kuf Chaf Aleph Amid Kuf Chaf Aleph, and today we're going to begin with Kuf Chaf Amid Beis, and just review the last part. The Mishnah had said that the Mishnah had said that the Korban Pesach must be completed before Chatzos, before halachic midnight, and after Chatzos, it is already nosar, it's leftovers of a kachim of a korban, and therefore it will make the hands tamei. And this is the halacha that Mishnah concludes with, the pigel and nosar, korban which had the wrong intent and became pigel, or nosar which was left over beyond the time they allowed to eat it, they make the hands of whoever touches it tamei. So the question is, the Korban Pesach being until midnight, until Chatzos, is this a deoraisa, a Torah obligation that the time for the Korban Pesach comes until midnight and that's it? As the Torah says, balayla hazeh, as we saw yesterday, that Rabbi Tzvi Fischer said, since it says balayla v'achles habasa balayla hazeh, you will eat the Korban Pesach on this night. And the Torah also said in regards to the makas bechoros, to the plague of the firstborn, that the plague will happen balayla hazeh, on this night. And just as this night over there was b'chatzos halayla, at the midnight, so to over here the plague is at night. So and until Chatzos, that night until Chatzos. That's the way Rabbi Tzvi Fischer, as we saw yesterday. And Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Rabbi Akiva says that the Torah says that you will eat the Korban Pesach b'chipazon, with haste, and the time of haste, the time that Bnei Yisrael were rushed out of Mitzrayim, is the time of is the morning, is dawn. And so therefore you eat the Korban Pesach until the morning, the entire night until Alis HaShachar, until dawn is when you can eat the Korban Pesach. And even though that we have a general rule that things that are permissible, mitzvahs that are at night, we eat them, we do them until midnight, as the first Mishnah in Brachos we learned. There, the reason is because the Chachamim didn't want us to fall asleep and then miss the mitzvah. And so the Krishma, which is the Mishnah over there in Brachos, we do before Chatzos in order not to miss it. But of course, the mitzvah really, on a Daraisa level, on a Torah level, the mitzvah is till the morning, and that's what Rabbi Akiva says. So we're in the midst of analyzing, according to Rabbi Akiva and according to Rabbi Tzvi Fischer, what they do with each other's interpretations. So the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Akiva, balayla, the fact that it says at night, is there to tell you a different halacha. We talked about this several times, that the Korban Pesach really is a shalomim. It's the peace offering, or the shlamim, which is a type of kachim that brings us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and brings us and we eat together with others. So the shlamim offering, generally the halacha is that it can be eaten the day you brought it, that night, and the next day. So it's eaten for 3 periods, if you would, of a day. Whereas other kabbanas are eaten the day you bring it and that night. The shlamim can be eaten the next day as well. So, but the Korban Pesach, it says balayla, to tell you that night. Now, Rabbi Tzvi Fischer said it to tell you that night up until midnight, because it says balayla hazeh, just like halayla, it says balayla hazeh by the makas bechoros. However, Rabbi Akiva says no. The word balayla is there to teach you that you don't eat it the day you bring the korban, only at night. Whereas other korbanos, you start at night. You start by day when you bring the korban, and you also can eat it that night, and a shlamim even the next day. The Korban Pesach is only at night. It doesn't start during the day. And this is smack in the middle of the page, where the lines both end with the word balayla. So Why does the Torah say that night? Yochel, because I may have thought that the carbon pesach can be eaten like other kachim the day you shecht it and the day you bring it. Therefore, we know that the carbon pesach does not get to be eaten the day you bring it on the 14th. You have to wait till the evening, till actually at night, and then you can eat it. It can be eaten at night and not the day that you bring it. And what does Rabbi Kiva do with the word hazeh, this night? It's coming to tell you that you can't eat it the following night as well. And here's the thought that the Gemara says, Rabbi Kiva says the Torah is coming to tell us does not work. We said the Pesach is a shlamim. And a shlamim offering, we said you can eat it the day you bring it, that night, and then the next day, which is 3 halachic half-day periods. Okay, so 3 periods, day, night, day. Well, the carbon pesach we just said, you can only start eating it at night. Well, I may have thought, well, if you can eat it at night and not the day that you bring it, so the 3 periods that you can eat it begin at night, and then you can eat it at night, the next day, and the next night. And perhaps, even though the Torah says balayla you eat it at night, maybe it means tonight, the night of the first Seder. And then also the second night, the next night, you can eat it as well. Even though you're in Yerushalayim, you're only going to have one Seder, but the idea is that you can eat it that night. And then the next night as well, you can eat the leftovers of the Karban Pesach, just like in other shlamim. Because I may have thought, the Pesach and the shlamim are alike, that they are minor kachim. Just as the shlamim can be eaten for 2-day periods, the day you bring it, and the next day, and the night in between. So then for the Pesach, I'll place the days, I'll switch the days for the nights, and I'll say the night for the days. And so the carbon Pesach, instead of being eaten like a shlamim, day, night, and day, you can eat it night, day, and night. And even though you can't eat it by day because the Torah said balayla, but it would mean either of the nights. It can be eaten for the 2 nights, and for the day in between, but you can't eat it on that day because the Torah says by night. So therefore, the Torah says this night, only this night, and not the other night. Rabbi Tzvi Fischer, Rabbi Tzvi Fischer says, I don't need a special teaching for that. The Torah already says, do not leave any over to the morning. There's no thought that you can leave it till the next day and then eat it the following night. It says, don't leave it over to the morning. However, Rabbi Kiva says, no, that's not proof at all. Maybe if I think that it's talking about balayla, eat it at night, and it's either one of the 2 nights, don't leave it to the morning, would be talking about the morning of the next day, the second day of Pesach. Boker Sheni, that would be the second morning. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he says, no, Boker Rishon. Now, if the Torah says morning, it's referring to the first morning, and that's it. Boker Rishon, it's the first morning. And so therefore, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, we eat it till midnight because it says balayla hazeh. And how do you know that you can't eat it beyond that? Because it says balayla hazeh, like midnight. And it says also, don't leave it until the morning. So I know that is the only time you can eat it. It starts at night, only until midnight, and whatever's left of the morning, you have to burn. And we already know, as we learned earlier, you can't burn it that morning because it's Yom Tov. You'd have to have Boker Sheni, a second morning to burn it. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, that balayla tells you that it's eaten that night, at night, not by day. And hazeh tells you this night, not the next night. And the entire night is when you eat it, and because we don't use a comparison to learn from the firstborn Makas Bachoris, because we need the teaching of Balayla Zeh for itself to tell you that you eat it on this very night and only this night. In any case, so Rabbi Akiva says that the Karban Pesach can be eaten on mid'oraisa on a Torah level all the way till the morning, until dawn. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says mid'oraisa you can only eat it until midnight. And therefore, what's left over at midnight already becomes tummy, and that's in our Mishnah. We'll make the hands tummy, and Rabbi Kiva says no, it doesn't become nosar until the morning. And indeed, if somebody were to miss the midnight deadline, according to Rabbi Kiva, you can still fulfill the mitzvah after that, as we saw in this discussion in the beginning of brachos, and the Rabbanan fence that they make to finish the mitzvahs that need to be finished by the morning, to finish by midnight, so one not miss the deadline. Amar Rava. Okay, so how does this translate to us for matzah? So Rava says, "Achal matzah bezman hazeh acha chatzos." If you ate matzah after midnight, according to Rabbi Elazar Nazari, did not fulfill the obligation. So the Gemara says, "Pshita." That seems pretty obvious, given the iskar shel Pesach. Pesach tummy. Since we learn it from Pesach, it's like the Korban Pesach that the Korban Pesach. It says al matzah samroim rachlu. You can eat the Korban Pesach with matzah and mor, and if the Korban Pesach can only be eaten until midnight, so matzah can only be eaten until midnight. The Gemara says no ma the tema ha'afker kra mehakesha. The Torah already says a separate mitzvah, be'erev tochel matzahs, that evening you'll eat matzah. And so the Torah extracted it from that generalization, from that rule of the Korban Pesach being with matzah being with the Korban Pesach, and perhaps it's an independent mitzvah, and therefore it's mitzvah the whole night. Kamash Milan. So therefore, Rava had to teach us, no, it is still included in with Pesach, and if, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you can only eat it until midnight, matzah also can only be eaten until midnight. The chi'ahadre kra, because now that the Torah put it back, lamilsa, lamilsa kamaisa hadre, it put it back to its original teaching. So here's the idea of this. We saw the Gemara earlier that said that really matzah was a part of the Pesach. The Torah extracted it and said be'erev tochel matzahs. However, the Torah also said that you shall eat matzah 7 days. And then it said 6 days you'll eat matzah, and the seventh day you will hold back at work. And we saw, and the Gemara said that that's coming to teach us that when the Torah says for 7 days you'll eat matzah, it's not a mitzvah chiyuvis, it's not an obligatory mitzvah. It's a mitzvah kiyumis, as we explained there, that if you do it, you'll fulfill the mitzvah. If you eat matzah, you will have a fulfillment of the mitzvah of matzah, but you're not obligated. You're allowed to just not have any matzah in any given meal throughout Yom Tov, besides for at the Seder, the Erev Tochel Matzahs, there's a special teaching. So when the Torah took it out of the rule and gave it its own mitzvah, it put it back to the original mitzvah, which is the connection to Pesach. And when it said that it's not the 7 days, but rather the first night has its own independent mitzvah, it took it back to the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. And just as the Korban Pesach is eaten according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah until Chatzos and no more, the mitzvah of matzah also is only until Korban Pesach and no more. So before we go any further to the last daf, which is actually today's daf, where I just wanted to discuss this idea and bring up and connect it to the previous halacha that we learned yesterday about not eating after afikomen, which is the flavor that's in your mouth from the mitzvah, the Korban Pesach, not to eat after that to dilute the flavor of the Pesach, and also the matzah, not to eat after the afikomen, the last matzah that you have, so as not to dilute the flavor of the matzah. So the mitzvah of matzah, we just said you have to complete the matzah before midnight. What happens if somebody's telling the Haggadah, and especially this year where Pesach comes after Shabbos, you really can't prepare in advance. You have to wait until you can make Havdalah, which is right after Shabbos, and you can't really prepare beforehand. So there's a lot of preparations that are happening at the very night of the Seder on account of that. You can't prepare from Shabbos into Matzah Shabbos, so you can't really prepare the Seder on Shabbos itself. Now, as a piece of advice, it's worthwhile preparing the Seder table before Shabbos on Friday and having it all set for Matzah Shabbos. So this way, and you eat your Shabbos meal elsewhere in a different part of the house. And this way, first of all, it's worthwhile because you're going to be eating chametz Friday night and Shabbos morning, Erev Pesach. So not to be close to where the Seder is going to be. Also, it's good advice because this way you have the Seder set and you eat the Shabbos meal maybe on a porch or somewhere else where it wouldn't interfere with the Seder. And in this way, as much as Shabbos comes, much of your Seder is already set, table set, and it's beautiful. And perhaps some of the cooking needs to happen and lighting the candles after Shabbos, but you're not going to be so busy preparing. In any case, either way, the Seder on a year like this, or really any Seder, or the second night of Seder, it can start very late. And as a result, you may not get to eat the afikomen before chatzos, before midnight, halachic midnight. And the nights are short, and as the nights are getting shorter, it's hard sometimes to make it. So what should one do? So there's a famous piece of advice from the Avnei Nezer, a great giant of the Hasidic thought, and he says perhaps what one can do is right before midnight eat a kazayas of matzah and say, well, if this is the time for afikomen, meaning if Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is correct that midnight is the end time of the mitzvah, well, then I'm eating this as my afikomen. And then wait a few minutes until midnight, and then they can start eating again. Because he assumed that the mitzvah of not eating after, in the mitzvah of not eating after afikomen, to dilute, so as not to dilute the flavor of matzah, that's during the time that the mitzvah exists. Once the mitzvah is over, you can dilute the flavor of the mitzvah. And so he said, eat the one kazayas of matzah and olive size of matzah as afikomen right before midnight, and then you wait till midnight, and then you can continue your meal or whatever it is that you're up to, and eat after that. And then when it comes later and comes to proper time of afikomen in your order, you're going to eat another kazayas as afikomen, and that way you'll fulfill it according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that the time for matzah is even beyond midnight. However, really, this takes us to the idea of not diluting the flavor, which we talked about yesterday. Is there a deadline? Till when can I not eat to dilute the flavor of the mitzvah? So as I just said, Avnei Nezer was of the assumption that it means while there's a mitzvah, you can't dilute the flavor of the mitzvah. But that really is would need a proof. The simple reading of that Gemara and the reading of Rashbam and others, the idea is that you have a flavor of mitzvah in your mouth. You don't want to dilute it, even after the time of the mitzvah is done. Even if you've already passed midnight, but if you can still taste the flavor of the korban Pesach in your mouth, so then you wouldn't eat anything, so as not to dilute the flavor because of chavivas ha-mitzvah, of the preciousness of the mitzvah. There's no mitzvah in the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah is to eat the korban Pesach or to eat the matzah. Once you're done, the mitzvah is done. The flavor is really just a show of honor and preciousness to the mitzvah. So who cares whether it's still the time of eating the mitzvah, eating the matzah, or eating the Pesach or not? It wouldn't change that. So just an interesting halachic discussion that links these two Gemaras. The idea of not eating after the afikomen, and the idea of according to Rabbi Tzvi Fischer, completing the eating of the matzah, even the afikomen matzah, before midnight. And actually in halacha, the Ramah says it would be best even to complete Hallel before midnight. But the ideas don't seem linked. And it would seem that even if you say that midnight is the time that you have to complete eating the matzah, according to Rabbi Tzvi Fischer, nevertheless, once you have the flavor of matzah in your mouth, you wouldn't eat anything else until that flavor of matzah is no longer there. Or if you have the korban Pesach flavor in your mouth, you wouldn't eat until that flavor is no longer there so as not to dilute the flavor. And even beyond the time that you're allowed to eat the mitzvah. And however, generally we say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva because halacha Rabbi Akiva mechavero. Whenever there's a machlekes between Rabbi Akiva and another, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. Midarabanan, it's best to try and eat it before midnight so as not to get carried away and forget the mitzvah. But mi'ikra din, the main halacha is that you can eat it until the morning. Kuf Chav. On the base at the bottom, the last part of this Mishnah. So we are on 120b, back into the Gemara, the last two lines of 120b. Pigul and nosar. Pigul is the idea of when you have the wrong intent in a korban. And we saw that there are many types of wrong intent. You can have the wrong intent of who the owner is. You can have the wrong intent of what type of korban it is. The wrong intent of that you're going to eat it beyond its time. The wrong intent you're going to eat it outside of its place. And so pigul is the idea of you're going to eat it beyond its time. And if somebody has the intent, meaning the kohen, has the intent that when he did one of the parts of the avodah, that this will be eaten beyond its time, that makes the korban pigul. And eating it is a transgression, and also the touching it will make your hands tummy. So that's a rabbinic enactment. As a rule, anything that only causes tumah to the hands is a rabbinic tumah. It's a darabanan, because there's no concept in the Torah. In the Torah, anything that is tameh is going to be tameh on the entire body. One tiny bit of tumah on the body, and the entire person becomes tameh. So this idea of tumas yadayim is really a fence that the Chachamim enacted. So Rav Huna and Rav Chisda explain, Chad Amar, one said, Mishum Chashti Kahuna. The reason is because of the the Kahanim that are not so trustworthy. V'chad Amar Mishum Atzlei Kahuna. And one said, the reason is because of the lazy Kahanim. Now, there are two different tumas that we're talking about. We were talking about the case where you had pigul, the wrong intent, and nosar, where it was leftover, like the korban pesach, which brings it up our subject matter to begin with. And the Gemara is going to explain that they're not arguing, they're talking about the two different parts. Chadama kezayis v'chadama kabetza. And one said it's talking about a kezayis, an olive size, and one said that it's talking about an egg size, a kabetza. So the Gemara now on Kuf Chaf Aleph, on Aleph at the top, Chad Tani Pigul. One is referring to the pigul, to the wrong intent. And that's for the Kahanim that we cannot trust. The idea is there may be a Kohen who is not of impeccable character, and he may see somebody he doesn't like. So this guy's bringing a korban, probably cost him a few $100s for this animal. I'm going to have a pigul thought. I'm going to have the wrong intent. And as a result, the korban is going to be invalid and it won't work. And I'll invalidate it for him. Or he may want a part of it. Rashi says that he's thinking, okay, I'm going to change the type of korban, and this way I'll get to eat more of it, because shlabim or Pesach or whatever it may be, he doesn't get to eat of it that much. So there is a question of how that fits with other halachas of pigul, but for now, those are the interpretations of what this kohen may be thinking. And as a result, he may intentionally invalidate the korban, have the wrong intent. And therefore, we tell the kohen, if that happens, your hands are tamei and you can't eat teruma, and it becomes a mess. And the Kahanim are very meticulous and very particular about tumah. Tumah was a very big idea. And so therefore, even if he was not so careful about hurting someone else and invalidating their korban, but tumah he didn't want to bring upon himself. And so that's the reason for the tumah of pigul. And the one that said because of the kahanim that are lazy, that's also this would motivate them to properly handle the korban and make sure there's no leftovers. Because if they were lazy, there's something left over there. What am I going to do with it? Who's going to eat it now? I'm going to have to go eat it or find somebody to eat it. I don't want to deal with it, and just leave it. That, to avoid that thought, they said, all right, well, when you do handle it, it's going to cause your hands to become tummy. And as a result, they would be more diligent in taking care of it. So Mantana Pigul, so the one that is referring to the Pigul mentions, because you can't trust all Kohanim, because maybe some Kohanim may be lazy. Now, one said about kazayas, one said that the measure is an olive size, and one said it's a kabetza measure. So mandama kazayas, the one that said it's an olive size, ki isuray. The reason is that it's like its prohibition. Umandama kabetza kutumase, and the one that says that it's tuma. Tuma is the susceptibility for tuma, or even in some cases, bringing tuma something else is at the size of a kabetza. And so therefore, the tuma that comes to the hands is going to be on an egg size of nosar, of leftovers, or of pigul, whereas the other opinion says no, eating is a prohibition as well. And at what size is it prohibited to be eat, even when olive size? So that's where the tuma would come. So that's the two opinions that they have. And in this, they're actually disagreeing because they're each one referring to both. The last Mishnah of the Masechta talks about the bracha on the Korban Pesach. We've not had the merit to make this bracha, but may we soon have this zchus of saying the bracha on the Korban Pesach and bring the Korban Pesach. And as we mentioned, the Korban Pesach has to be eaten al hasova. It has to be eaten when you're satiated. So the Korban Pesach would sometimes, if there was a large crowd at the Seder, and so everybody would only have a little bit of the Korban Pesach, olive size or more, but not enough to satiate them. So the Korban Pesach would not be eaten al hasova unless you have something else to eat. So they would bring another korban, a chagigas yudalid. On the 14th, they would bring a korban chagiga yantiv korban, which would be the meat for the Seder. And subsequent to that, at the end, when you're already full but not stuffed, you would eat the Korban Pesach. So the bracha on the Korban Pesach would be Asher Kedushanim and Tzivanu for eating a Pesach, Lechol HaPesach, to eat the Korban Pesach. And then there's a general bracha for eating kachim, which is Le'echol HaZevach, or Alachil HaZevachim. So to eat the Zevach or the eating of kachim. And so the question is, if you said bracha on one before the other, does it fulfill the bracha for it? So birchas haPesach, if you made the bracha on the Korban Pesach, even though it's specific to the Pesach, patar shel zevach, it also covers the bracha of eating the korban, the other korban, which accompanies the Pesach. Whereas birch al shel zevach, if you make the bracha on eating the korban, the chagiga, loy patar shel zevach shel Pesach, you did not cover the Pesach, and you have to make a separate bracha for eating the Pesach. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Whereas Rabbi Kiva says, Lezu b'tarazu v'lezu b'tarazu. No, there are two different mitzvahs, two different brachas, they do not cover each other at all. So to understand this next Gemara, the Gemara is going to make a comparison to another halacha. A Korban Pesach is a type of shlomin. Most karbanos, the Torah says how to spritz the blood on the mizbeach, on the altar. The Korban Pesach is one of just a few, three karbanos where the Torah doesn't say how to spritz the blood. But the Torah does say a general statement of the the blood of your korban you will spill. And generally we know that every korban needs to have the blood spritzed, and that the korban would have it sprayed or thrown. So these are called shvicha and zrika. Zrika, throwing it, shvicha, pouring it. The Korban Pesach, according to almost all opinions, and Rabbi Kiva and Rishmael, both of them agree, that the Korban Pesach actually is poured directly at the Yesod, out on the base of the Mizbeach, at the corner, and this would be in the north eastern corner of the Mizbeach. You would pour it right there. However, the other karbanos, all other karbanos, really needs to be thrown. It would, even if some of them need to be thrown on two corners, on the opposite corners, and so this way it hits the corner, it goes on two sides, and then the other opposite corner hits on two sides, and then there's blood on all four sides of the mizbeach. And sometimes it just needs one spritz keneged side where the base of the mizbeach is, but it's thrown, as opposed to the Korban Pesach where it's poured. The question is, when the mitzvah is to pour it, if you threw it, did that fulfill the mitzvah? Meaning the Korban Pesach, if where it's supposed to be poured, if you threw it, does that fulfill it? And vice versa, where the mitzvah is to throw it, if you poured it, is that going to fulfill the mitzvah? So Keshetim Tzaloimar, the Gemara says, L'divrei Rabbi Yishmael, according to Rabbi Yishmael, that says that the bracha of the Korban Pesach includes the bracha for the Korban Chagiga, but not vice versa. That means doing what works for the Chagiga does not cover the Pesach. We can say the same for the spritzing. That's Zurika Bechlal Shvicha. That if you did what works for the Korban Pesach, meaning pouring it, for the carbon that needs to throw it, that would work, because we see that the Korban Pesach is a more inclusive and type of carbon. It includes just as the bracha includes the other carbon, so to the pouring, which is valid for the Korban Pesach, would include and be valid for the other carbon. However, but not the other way around, where you need to pour it, the Korban Pesach. If you did what the other carbon works is valid with, it's not going to work for the Korban Pesach, and that's why the bracha also. If you said the bracha for the other carbon on the Pesach, it won't work. However, we would say, according to Rabbi Akiva, that pouring doesn't work when you need to spritz, and spritzing doesn't work when you need to pour. Each one has its own halacha, and you have to do it correctly. Tosfos has length questions some of these assumptions that we just said. In any case, that seems to be the way the Rashbam learns this, and the way this Gemara says it. No more details as to the spritzing and what requires spritzing and when one doesn't work if it's done in the incorrect way. We go to Kuf Chaf Aleph Amid Beis 121b, the last few lines of the Masechta, and I will read all the way to the end, but the last line Steve will repeat and make and not learn with us right here, because he's going to do a siyum on Thursday for the firstborn to exempt everybody from a fast because of the siyum. So Reb Shimlai iklil pidyon haben. So once we're talking about two brachas that coincide, so Reb Shimlai tells us that once he came to a pidyon haben, to the redemption of the firstborn, which by the way is very much linked with Pesach, which is because of the redemption of the firstborn, because of the death of the firstborn, and that our firstborn did not die, that we have the pidyon haben because the firstborn were dedicated as Kohanim, and the Kohanim we redeemed them from the Kohanim. So we have the redemption of the firstborn on the 31st day and beyond of the birth of the firstborn, and he came to such a redemption. And Bayimine Pshita, and they asked him, we know, it's obvious to us, al pidyon haben, that on the actual redemption, the father is going to say the bracha, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvah, al pidyon haben. You commanded us and made us holy with the mitzvahs of pidyon haben, of redeeming the son. Avi haben mavarach, so that the father will say. However, what about the shehechiyanu? Baruch shehechiyanu v'kimanu v'yanu l'zman hazeh. The bracha of shehechiyanu. Who says that? The kohen is receiving the money as redemption, or the father who is essentially so-called receiving his son back in this redemption? The Kohen says the bracha of the father. The Kohen says the bracha because he gets 5 silver coins. The father because he's doing a mitzvah of redemption. He said, I don't know, good question. So he came to the academy, to the base midrash, and he asked. Amrule, they said to him, Avi ben Mavarich, the father says the bracha. And this last line of what the halacha actually is, Steve will say on Thursday and do the hadron. For us, the hilchasa Avi ben Mavarich shtayim. The halacha is that the father says the bracha, both brachas. He says the bracha on pidyon haben. He says the bracha shehechiyanu. Hadron lach. Arvei Pesachim. With this, we complete the 10th parak Arvei Pesachim, and we shall come back to you Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach Hasalikala Maseches Pesachim, and we complete Maseches Pesachim. Hadron Loch Maseches Pesachim, Hadron Loch Halon, Daitalon Maseches Pesachim, Daitachalon, Lenis Hashem Minach Maseches Pesachim, Lenis Hashem Minon, Lebad Alma Deim Ma'amad. Also, we come back to you Be'ez Hashem. We'll do this together with Steve as he completes the Masechta on Thursday morning. Mazel Tov, and Be'ez Hashem tomorrow morning we will begin Masechah Shkolah. Mazel Tov to all.